Welcome back to Econothon from the World Bank Group. I am Saeed Halimi. We are now on hour 15 of our ambitious life event, 24 hours of non-stop talk about the economics of development with experts from the bank and beyond. For the next hour of this broadcast, I will be bringing you some of the highlights of the bank's recent discussions. It's now 3 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. In Marrakesh, it's 8 in the morning, 9 a.m. in Paris, and it's 3 in the afternoon in Kuala Lumpur. We got a lot to cover, so stay tuned. But first, let's go to some tape from our spring meeting. In this session, the panel explored the ambition of digital moonshot for Africa aimed at speeding up progress there. Presenter Julie Gichuru kicked it off with a question for Rwandan Minister for ICT, Paula Ingabire.
Great to have an incredible panel with us. Paula, I think I'll begin with you and the Rwanda experience, because Rwanda has made some great strides when it comes to access to broadband connectivity, affordability as well, but maybe uptake is not quite what it should be. What are you doing as a country to increase uptake, and how important is skills building? What's your effort in that regard as well, please?
Thank you. I think just to start off, I can't say that Rwanda's model is a one-size-fits-all approach that every country could undertake. Everything for each of the countries, you tailor some of these models and interventions given your context, the purchasing power of your people, and the dynamics in the ecosystem. But I think for all of us, the starting point is providing coverage. And as a country, that was our starting point, to say, what do we do to put in place sufficient coverage, where today both 3G and 4G coverage is at more than 92% in terms of geographic coverage. And like I said, when I say it's not a one-size-fits-all, for some it's going to be purely private investment, for others it's going to be public-private partnerships, and that has been the case for Rwanda, where to an extent the public had to really put in the investment, the initial investment, to trigger the private sector to come on board, but also even to roll out connectivity, last-mile connectivity, we then had to enter into a type of PPP model that allows for us to extend this to the people. Mm-hmm. While a lot of the discussion focuses on models, I think uptake boils down to two things: access and affordability. And I think for Rwanda's case particularly, when you look at access, where we have a wholesale model for 4G, you have all the mobile network operators having their own 3G networks, but we've also encouraged infrastructure sharing, where you have the towers and the fiber all under an infrastructure sharing model. And overall, I think Rwanda has the lowest broadband prices, even in as much as the uptake is still very low. Right. So when I said it was about access and affordability, yes, we have the connectivity, but I think when it comes to access, then we need to think about devices. We need to think about ways of bundling services so that these services can be consumed by the people and are affordable for them. And I think what we've been doing is really to put in place a policy and regulatory framework which fosters access, which looks at affordability, but also availing spectrum to all these operators at affordable prices, putting in place a reasonable tax regime, and then providing relevant content. And to speak to your point about skills...
I will come back to that in just a short while, so thank you for setting the context for us. So I will come back to the skills issue. Minister Nasser, I want to jump to you now. An exciting time, of course, Egypt chairing the AU. The digital agenda for Africa is massive. You are in charge of ICT as well as investment in Egypt. That's your docket. I want you to paint a picture for us of your vision for Africa's digital economy. What should it look like, and what role is the Egyptian government playing?
Thank you very much, and it's great to be on a panel with the majority dominance of women, and that's key in Africa. So something we want to promote even further. I'll start first with Egypt. What's happening back in Egypt is that we've moved forward with a comprehensive digital transformation strategy that is focused on three main pillars. Infrastructure, which was highlighted by Mokhtar at the beginning, that requires adequate and sufficient infrastructure. Second, that you want the right ecosystem and the right conducive business environment to allow the private sector to come in to complement the work that the government has been undertaking, and that's key. So how can you make the environment conducive? Third is investing in human capital, is training, and training the skills is very critical here, and especially in lagging regions and lagging governorates, and that's another important pillar. In Egypt, we're also moving with smart cities and new communities that are also will promote more innovative technology and digital transformation. And of course, access to finance and the services, the digital services that we provide to people, including investors, automating the whole system, making the environment conducive, because that's also is a very excellent tool for combating any corruption, but also e-financing is critical. One thing that's one thing we are working also to scale up while Egypt His Excellency President Sisi is presiding the African Union. In fact, as we are here today during a presidential visit, we have the Minister of ICT. My colleague is signing agreements with Senegal yesterday with Cote d'Ivoire, and we are scaling up that with many, making use of our presidency to support. And there, I want to highlight that the World Bank has been very supportive on that, and I'm so happy to hear Mokhtar saying that now we'll have one regional director in charge of doing that, because that's one challenge that we face, because access to finance is important, and we rely on the bank on providing finance for infrastructure especially. We've done a marvelous job on renewable energy and transportation, and ICT is a priority, and hope that this unification at the IFI, I hope other IFIs follow suit, because there is a lot of disaggregation, MENA region versus Africa. So one last point that I want to stress that we're focusing on is digital entrepreneurship. That's very important, startups, and bringing in the private sector in last December in Sharm el-Sheikh, where we had the Africa 2018 conference that was where we had 7 heads of state for Africa. We launched also the entrepreneurship, the startup in Africa, where we had 100 success stories. FinTech, where we're putting a platform for young entrepreneurs, accelerators, technical finance, access to finance, and also using the mobile and the different innovative tools to promote innovation in Africa for young, with a lot of focus on women. So we are making sure that at least 50% of our startups that we're very proud of, and we're very passionate about supporting our women and young, in a very young continent.
Thank you for that, Minister. I think that's what it's all about. It's really how to get the different sections of the population engaged, participating and thriving in this economy. Let me come to you, Minister Musheru, now. And of course, you know, the Kenya story has been told over and over again. Everywhere you go, it's the M-Pesa story, and you know, that the transformation that enabled. But I want you to share with us, what can other African economies learn from the Kenya experience, and what challenges are you facing now? Because things are moving really fast. We're rolling out 5G now. There's still a lot to be done. So what challenges do you still face? What advice do you have for African economies, please?
Thank you very much, Julie, and good morning, everybody. It's great for the World Bank to be discussing digital in Africa. This is something that we've fought for a long time. M-Pesa is something that people have talked about a lot. And I would say first, we're trying to take advantage of opportunities. I won't call them quite challenges. I think it's new opportunities that come up when we look at the transformation that M-Pesa has given. I think when we started as a country, the main challenge was, you know, you're asking people to become almost mini banks across the whole country. They advertise that they have cash because that's where people will be going and cashing in. And the concept was not understood. The challenge that was there is that, you know, really can you send money using mobile? I think that's now something of the past. Everybody knows that you can be able to do that. But then the banks came in and started having a challenge. I think when the licensing was done, the mobile money platforms were supposed to be just transport. There was not meant to be any, storage of the money. Unfortunately, you can't go and force people that once you put money into the wallet that you have to take it out. So now there's the push between the banks and the mobile operators, and really the finance ministers, and I see CS Rotich here from Kenya. One of the key places it started was with the banks. So you'll find a lot of the other African countries take this platform first to the banks, and the banks have a different way of viewing how you transfer money. M-Pesa was able to transfer money, at fractions of cents, almost similar to what you're now seeing with digital currencies, and the banks have a challenge. The technology is usually the easiest part. We use USSD, which is probably the lowest of technology. Now M-Pesa has an app built on it, which uses data. But even with USSD, it is stable and it works. The key thing is being able to find and register all the users that will be using the platforms and all the value adds that come now from there. So now we have many of the people using these platforms being able to receive money. You need data that will allow you to be able to offer now loans. So many of the banks who have the money can now be able to offer other financial services such as credit to the users. And I think you can get credit in less than 3 minutes. Mm-hmm. You apply, and the limits that are now being provided are increasing so that you're able to give even more money. So the mobile platforms or the digital platforms are the way to go. And what we have found for us is that identifying people, security issues have been very key. So we've introduced, and through the support of the president, the National Integrated Identity Management System. We're in the process of registering all 50 million Kenyans biometrically. So we take their fingerprints and their photograph so that you have one single source of truth. This is something that we need across the whole continent, because again, if you now want to transact across borders, this is one of the ways that you're going to be able to allow all citizens to be able to transact and get services. So it's an area of more opportunities, and the challenges are really more about awareness and understanding. And I think the collaboration that is now coming between the mobile operators who provide the platforms and the banks in lending money is very useful.
Thank you for that. Commissioner, that brings me very nicely to you. And driving conversations with young Africans, there's a real pain that we are not able to transact with each other. There's a real struggle for Africa to do business with herself because of issues like, access to platforms where we can send money, pay each other. Let's talk about how Africa can work jointly to seize these great opportunities, especially considering the fact that our realities and our needs are just so different and so vast. How do you as the Commission view this, and what's your role in this process?
Thank you, Julie, and let me thank everybody for being here today. And it was mentioned that the majority of the participants on this panel are women. But let's also emphasize that 2 of them are Egyptians. So that's, again,
Fantastic.
A true pleasure to be here. And thank you very much for the question. As you rightly said, Africa and African leaders came together a few years ago, and with one vision, one mission through the African Union. And that's the integration of the continent. So when we say Africa, it's one Africa, east, west, north, center, south, and island states. And I'm so very happy that finally at the World Bank you came up with this realization. Now we have a regional integration director looking at Africa as a continent as a whole. This is not an easy task, as you rightly mentioned, because we're talking about more than 50 countries with different realities, different levels of development, for certain sectors, and with major challenges. So that is the case. However, we are determined to overcome these challenges and to overcome these differences. So with the important role of the African Union is how to bring together all our countries on the same page and within the same vision in a particular sector. Talking about digital transformation. Digital transformation, and I'm insisting on the word transformation because it's not just about digitization it's a total and complete shift and change from what we were doing before, traditionally been done throughout the world, into a new way of doing things in all sectors. So as much as I insist, or everybody has talked about the importance of infrastructure and technical aspects, this is just one side of the story and just the basic. But the thing is, each and every sector, each and every job is seeing in Africa a true transformation as we speak. As we speak. You've heard about the virtual banks, about financial inclusion, about smart cities, and the list can go on, with major and profound impact on the lives of people. Now, our role as the African Union is to formulate or to formulate a vision, a common strategy, a common framework for all these efforts, whether the country's efforts, our leaders' efforts at the national level, but also the efforts and the initiatives initiated or is being done together with our partners, together in one comprehensive, holistic approach that works for Africa, so as the success story is not anecdotal in one or a few countries, but rather it becomes the continent's success story, and the transformation is throughout the continent. And that is not, something that I'm dreaming of, it's a reality. Remember, last year, in 2018, we launched the free trade area, the continental free trade area in the continent. In less than a year, is getting into force, is becoming effective in July. We launched
Can we give that a round of applause?
Of course. The passport, the free movement of people, the liberalization of airspace, we are moving very fast on the continent, and we are determined to make the technology work for us as well and in Africa.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And, Lanre, that brings me right to you, doing some incredible work in different spaces across Africa. But I know in your own country, you're not doing anything right now.
Yet.
The issue of policy is critical. And I want to tap into this. I want this to be a relevant conversation. I want you to speak to your key stakeholders. And government, I suppose, is one of them. But for you to do effective work in the digital economy in Africa, what do you require, and what are your greatest hindrances at the moment? Let's make this real.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And C-Squared is not in Nigeria yet, but it will be in Nigeria very soon. Okay. And, Madam, there are also 2 Nigerians on the panel. So, there are 2 things. Okay, and they're very similar things. One of them is the policy, and the other one is the investments. Those are the 2 things that hinders us in what we do, basically. Now, and you see, the 2 are actually 2 separate ends of the same thing. The policymakers, government, regulations, laws, and regulators. Investments, financial institutions like the World Bank, the IFC, the OPIC, everybody that can give money to do investment, private equity firms. The issue that you have with fiber and fiberizing Africa, which is one thing that Africa is very passionate about, and C-Squared is very passionate about, is that fiber and broadband penetration is a long-term game, okay? You need patient capital. You don't want somebody giving you money and wants a return in 5 years. It won't work. You're talking about 10, 15 years, right? But you see the underlying impact of that infrastructure, that digital infrastructure, and what it does to the African. It changes the mindset of the African youths, okay? Mukhtar was talking about 300,000 youths, people that are going to be unemployed. By 2045, there will be 400 million African youths, okay? If we don't do a digital transformation that we're talking about, if we don't have the right infrastructures, if our governments don't, and I'm going to create your indulgence, wake up to the fact that they need to fix this problem of letting the environment get liberalized for things to happen, of letting private sector, and I repeat, private sector actually lead these initiatives to get it to happen, then we have a big problem. Now, why private sector? we've been doing these things for a very long time, since the 60s, when a lot of African countries had independence. They've gotten a lot of money from the World Bank. They've gotten a lot of money from everywhere else. They've gotten grants. What have they done with it all this while, okay? But guess what has happened in the digital space and in the telecom space in Africa? It was private initiatives that have given us, in Nigeria, phones for the first time in like a very long time, yeah? M-Pesa happened in Kenya. It was Safaricom, okay? So there were different businesses that are doing different things to get that. So two things. Policy makers must make it happen, and the right investments must come in. So soft money must be given to private companies like C Squared that will provide open access networks, okay, that everybody else can use. So the information highway can be created, but you see the underlining and the bagwagon effects that you get from that is what is most important in what you do. So the government must regulate. They must put the right framework in place for the private sector to thrive.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. That brings me to skills, acquired knowledge that is required for all this to happen as well. And it brings me to Omowale the Andela's story. As a recognized talent developer in Africa, there's a lot to be done. So what's your rallying call to us all? We have government here, we have private sector here, we have financiers in this room as well, we have civil society. What's your message to us?
Good morning. Thank you very much. Well, since everyone is talking about the composition of the panel, if diversity is how we win in the world, then I think Nigeria is already winning on this panel, because not only are we two, there's one man and one woman, right? Okay. So the Andela story I'm really passionate about because, everybody has talked about technology and all of that, but people have to build the technologies. Everything that we're going to do in the digital transformation, people have to build it. So we need those skills. And Andela started on that premise. There's a global talent shortage, the skills to build the technology. Andela started on that premise that, we have 1.2 billion people in Africa. Brilliant youths, fastest growing youth population. What if, given the right infrastructure, the right resources, the right learning science, what if we do that? Would we make a difference? And the Andela story shows that we are. 1,100 software engineers who are world-class. And with our ALC program, we've empowered about 33,000 youths across Africa, 17 countries, and still doing more. But that's just one Andela. So if we all, contribute to that, then it's limitless what can come out of Africa. I'm not going to belabor the point, but infrastructure is really, really important. I want to talk about, because we're talking about skills, and I was saying this before when we're talking, there's something that's very interesting that is not just Africa, it's a world issue. The international language of programming is English. Programming is how we build all the technologies we're talking about. But it's interesting that 95% of the world does not speak English as their native language. And so that itself is something that we need to address. In Africa, in Andela, we're in about 5 countries. We've been going to the English-speaking countries, and then we now have our Pan-African hub in Rwanda. And one of the challenges that we first saw, brilliant people, English, because programming is in English. Wow. And so we've had to do English level-up programs. And so that's part of what we need to include in this programming. Somebody asked me about China. Do they code in English? Probably not. But when you look at China, you probably have, maybe 2 major languages. When you look at Africa, in Nigeria alone, we have over 500 tribes and languages. So, one solution is to start developing programming languages in our languages. But I think the faster way is we're going to have to level up in what is currently the international language of programming.
Thank you. And I think, yes, please, Amani, come in. Yes.
Yes, I wanted to emphasize this point because this is an important one. It's not just about the coding, but the local content. Mm-hmm. So the content of what comes on the internet, what comes in this digital sphere, it has to be local in our own language, within our own context, reflecting our own issues. And that's not happening now. But we are increasingly seeing across the continent, and we are encouraging this across the... Good morning, Kristalina. Since her absence is here, even through the Broadband Commission, the ITU Broadband Commission, we are emphasizing the the local content. Just as an example, we have this competition across the continents called Miss Geek that we launch in Kigali every year within the Transform Africa. And last year, she was a girl, 14, 15 years old from Niger. She has developed this app in Hausa. For her own community and to help with the community and the women in the community. That's what we also want to see happening throughout the country.
Thank you for emphasizing that. And I think we can say that those who develop local, relevant content will win in Africa. And already we are starting to see that happen. Let me just recognize the presence of World Bank CEO Kristalina Georgieva, who has joined us, and she will speak a little bit later, I believe, will share a word or two with us. I come back to Paula now, and we had started, you were just about to start touching on skills, but we've gone into this, and this is exciting. In order for us to ensure that businesses, government, individuals, every single person, no one left behind, is able to be part of the digital economy, what is Rwanda doing when it comes to skills? How are you addressing this?
Thank you. And since myself and Musheru do not want to miss out on this contest, I think we have two East Africans on the panel.
Can I just say we have
three. So I guess we get to win anyway.
I think ultimately, can I say this, and this is important, we are Africans, and that's why we are here. So please go ahead.
Well, we didn't want to miss out anyway. So when you brought up the issue of skills at the beginning of my discussion, what I wanted to say was, beyond infrastructure, beyond the regulatory environment, and putting in place, the right structures, skills, it really boils down to the skills. How do we build, and I think yesterday we touched on it lightly in the previous panel where we talked about building a digitally literate population. And that's very important. But today I want to focus more on the supply side, which is really what we're discussing on this panel. And what Rwanda is really doing, because we've positioned ourselves to be an innovation hub, where we want to be a proof of concept hub, it means as a government we've had to be very deliberate about how much investment we put into research and innovation, because those are the capabilities that are going to be able to create the relevant local content that you were talking about, alluding to earlier. And just to give concrete examples, she did mention about Andela creating a Pan-African hub that is really grooming, a diverse group of software developers. And today, when you walk into their campus in Kigali, you can see the diversity of the African population. It's not just Rwandans, it's a whole range of Africans who are passionate about creating local solutions that are relevant to the African context. The other thing that we've done, and really this is very unique to Rwanda as positioning itself as a proof of concept hub, is how do we also position ourselves as regional centers of excellence, where we can be able to groom the critical mass of skills, not just for Rwanda, but for the rest of the continent. This is where we've been able to attract Carnegie Mellon University, that is offering master's degrees in AI and robotics and computer engineering. You have the likes of AIMS, which is the Institute for Mathematical Sciences, which is also providing a master's in artificial intelligence. These are very specific to artificial intelligence, but when you look at the broad ecosystem of academia and industry players that we are trying to attract into Rwanda, they're looking at a broad range of professional skills that are required to really, for Africa to leverage emerging technologies and embed and diffuse these technologies into the different aspects of the society.
Thank you for that. Amani, I'll come to you before I move to Minister Nasser, because I just want to tap into the fact that Africa has got to confront the realities of changing education needs and a vastly changing and fast-changing future of work. How can the AUC also help African governments in reorganizing or managing this need for change around education? Briefly, please.
Education and skills in general. I mean, here we're talking about skills for the youth, leaving no one behind, making sure that our young population is digitally enabled and educated, but also those who are already the older generation, There's also the responsibility of retraining and upskilling that exists in the workforce, bridging the gap urban-rural. Remember, I mean, we have a serious gap on the continent. Most of our urban centers are connected, but not the rural. Bridging the gap landlocked and coastal countries. So there's a lot to be said about leaving no one behind, and it's not just about the individual, but where you are within a country and where you are on the continent. And the generational gap. We have to talk about all these things. Mm-hmm. So within the work of Michael Lead, the Commissioner for Science and Technology and Education, that's another aspect that we are working on in our strategy for education and skills enhancement and STEM, and that's the push we are also giving in education and in training. It's no longer the training programs. If on the continent anyone is training our young people or older population on the skills that exist today, then we lost the battle already.
Then we're finished.
Then we're finished.
Minister Nasser, let me come to you and the question of financing, which we've touched on the fact that we need patient capital, we need innovative models, perhaps. Tell us your perspective from Egypt. What's interesting? What's exciting? What works?
What works and what we need to focus on in the coming period is. I want to here highlight the issue of the young population in Africa, and because you've asked on the education reforms that is currently taking place. The initiative that we are moving forward with in collaboration with all the African countries is establishing an entrepreneurship hub, a platform for young people, a digital platform for young people to create their own jobs, to transform their innovative ideas into reality, into real projects on the ground. And this is one of the main announcements that the President, in his capacity as presiding the African Union, has launched. So we want something like the Silicon Valley, the Berlin, the London, where young people not just get access to finance, but also the skills, the capacity building, the know-how, the network that it takes for these startups, the young entrepreneurs, to succeed and create jobs. And because at the end of the day, our ultimate objective is to have a comprehensive strategy for inclusive and sustainable growth, and that would only occur when young people are able to contribute positively and in a very productive manner to their economic spheres. So this is one initiative we're working on. We're working very closely with the World Bank Group, both the bank in terms of policies, because it's very important to have the conducive environment that is encouraging young people to transform their innovation into projects on the ground. But we're also working with IFC, and we had the launch of the 100 African startups as role models to encourage young people, because also you have to, there is the change of culture required there, the digitalization, transformation of digitalization, but also the entrepreneurship culture, and I think packaging them together makes a difference. On education, Egypt is moving forward with a very comprehensive education reform, and that is something we are also working very closely with our friends and partners, but also our African countries. And I think that's also one thing we are working closely with Amani on, because it's also digital, because we're also doing a partnership on, for example, teachers, early childhood education and curriculums, and there the sharing of knowledge and expertise among African countries matters a lot. Another area which is very important links is healthcare services. Right. That's a priority area, pharmaceutical. And so what we're doing with the digital platform is connecting healthcare services to capture the knowledge, the expertise, especially on a very critical issue that is health, and that is all about investing in human capital. So young entrepreneurs, education and health and vocational training is critical for a growing and prosperous Africa.
Thank you for that. Joe Musheru, that brings me right to you. And it's great to have the hubs and the centers that will address the needs of maybe the slightly more sophisticated, those who are more ready, more refined, maybe a little bit more urban. But But it's not enough because we know that Africa is diverse and we have a lot of rural populations in urgent need of solutions as well. So from your perspective, when you look at the potential, and I think, agriculture plays a big role here, but I really want to hand this monster to you, that Africa is massive and hubs may not be enough. And what is then the solution when you have willing partners sitting down saying, look, we are all in this, we want to transform? What is the answer for so many who are on the fringes, who are not at the center?
Thank you, Julie. In fact, I was going to say the youth and the Africans are not waiting for us as governments. They're actually moving forward already, and it's for us to now catch up with them in providing the infrastructure that they need, providing all the services that governments have to provide. And I think the best example is this digital work. In Kenya today, we've just done a survey. We have got over 638,000 people that are just working, young people. Some of them are working for actually many multinational companies. I'll give an example. In one of our EPZs, there's thousands working, and what they're doing is that they're just labeling packages from one of the top logistics companies here in the US and actually globally. So they package, they do that. There's others that are following the NFL, they record all the games, and then they're the ones labeling what each player did, and by the end of the morning, they've sent back that here to the US, and you can go to each player and say, you played well, you did not play well.
Wow.
It is being labeled by very young people actually in Kenya right now. They didn't go to formal education. Nobody is there right now teaching them on how to be able to do these things. They're learning on the job, and that number is actually growing exponentially.
That's great, but before you continue, then what is our responsibility as governments to then really step in, and what is the role now to take it to the next level?
In fact, that's where I was going to go. Right. So there are two things. One, many of these jobs are available online. In fact, as government, we've started a program called Ajira Digital, where we're providing the awareness to the young people and then skilling the young people so that they can know how to be able to do these jobs, how to behave when they're online. So you receive a job, you must actually deliver. You can't just receive and then you don't deliver because the quality then changes. But we as governments must provide the infrastructure that's required. This infrastructure includes how do they get paid, the financial services. When they receive their money, do you actually immediately accept the money, or do you start questioning, is it clean money, is it not clean money? Because again, not everyone has understood what this money is. And it's, some of them are earning thousands of dollars. So you want to give them the skills, you want to give them the infrastructure that they will need, because you need good connectivity. You need to provide them with the identification. If you can't identify who did that work or who is actually working on the other end, then some of these companies will not give some of the secure information. So you want to give medical records to be transcribed. How will they be transcribed if you can't tell who these people are? So digitally, you must make sure everyone has an ID. You can be able to tell it's so-and-so, this is where they logged in, this is where the services are. And in terms of awareness, you want to make sure that not only do they know that those opportunities are there, but also businesses. You'll find that the private sector are the ones that are really pushing for these jobs and for these young people to be able to work. Right. They want to be recognized, and in a sense, we have got wild structures of how you employ people. So if you're employing people on what are called tasks, then you can't give the contracts that are required, the insurance and all these things. So you have to find ways of making sure that the new ways of working, the regulations take that into account. You'll find when we're looking at these skills in Kenya, one of our challenges has been many of the jobs actually being done in English. Our languages are disappearing. I'm sure most of you use Siri or OK Google. They don't understand our languages. And in fact, at some point, this artificial intelligence is going to create an intelligence gap between our people and those that speak these other the languages like English and so on. So we need to take charge. I mean, some companies who I was talking to have already put translation services in their platforms.
Thank you.
But they've left out most of Africa.
So red flag issue there that we need
those
to
are
keep
things
an eye
we
on.
must take into, especially with these artificial intelligence areas that are coming.
Thank you.
So that we're not left behind.
I see Paula and Amani. So Paula, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Very quickly, and just to respond, when you asked the question, I felt like I needed to speak to this. I think one of the things that we need to do as governments is to be open to disrupt education. And we've seen examples in many places, including where you have coding for employment programs and coding programs where some of these skills are embedded at secondary school level. And by the time students are getting out of secondary school, they are employable. They do not have to even go through a university education, but they can quickly get into the workforce. The second thing is, at a very early stage of education, there are things we need to be deliberate about, like numeracy and literacy, where English and math or French and math become like foundational subjects before one can move to the next level. The last bit that I want to talk about is upskilling of teachers. Teachers will not give what they do not have. How much are we thinking deliberately about upskilling them in this digital economy?
Thank you so much. Aman?
I would like to add, to all the excellent things that have been said by the two ministers about the liberalization of the economy, the ecosystem, the skills, but also it is our role as governments to protect. So cybersecurity is of major importance. The personal data protection and laws and conventions across the continent are of prime importance, and we should not overlook this while we digitalize. So this is an important message. The rights, particularly the rights of children. So many things are happening online, and it's not a coincidence that at the African Union we adopted the Convention on Cybersecurity, Personal Data Protection, and the heads of states approved it as a flagship project for the continent. That also the Commission for the Rights of Children is taking very seriously the protection of children online. I think these are things also we have to think of as governments.
Thank you for bringing that in. Lanre, I come to you now, because when Joe Musheru started talking about the fact that things are moving in spite of government, Lanre's energy levels just hit the roof. So you have something to say about this. Please contribute your thoughts.
Very simple, okay?
Yeah.
1 billion people, okay? All they need is opportunities. Create the opportunities, they will thrive. All you need is the access, and you need to read and write. I don't need to understand chemistry to be a pharmacist, okay? If I can read and write, and then have access to the internet, the largest library in the whole world, right? I can be like the Malawian boy that harnessed the wing, okay? William Kamkwamba, okay? And do more. There are 1,000,001 William in Africa.
Right.
Empower them to do greater things.
Wow.
Okay? I was talking earlier about government. C-Squared has an initiative that what we did in Liberia. That thing only happened because USAID, the government of Liberia, and C-Squared actually implemented it. So it's a public-private partnership initiative. We have 200 kilometers of fiber in less than a year in a place that didn't have anything before. We've connected 50 government institutions. We've connected universities. 11 universities in Liberia right now will have Wi-Fi. For the first time, they're going to have broadband. Yeah? It's going to change the lives of those people. So empowering people to tap opportunities, it's what all this is all about. 2030, for me, is too far. We need to do it now. We need to have done it yesterday.
Right.
It needs to be open access. It must not be owned by one person. The government must provide the enabling environment. I understand cybersecurity. I understand controls and all that. But you see, if you don't... the problem is we are going to be digitally colonized if we don't wake up in Africa. We need to do things now, not tomorrow. Not if what Minister Mishori was talking about, IDs and biometrics. Okay, if you had that, we can have digital elections as is done in Estonia. Okay, it becomes transparent. Then we don't have dictators in place because people can get out of power because things are happening. So when you do this internet thing that you're talking about and you get broadband to everybody, yeah, It's going to change everything from the political landscape to the economic life. Just leave the rest to the Africans. We will make it happen.
Thank you. Thank you. Create the environment, leave the rest to the Africans. Can I just say Julius Yego of Kenya became an award winner on the javelin from watching YouTube. So, I mean, just give it to them and they'll make it happen. Joe, very quickly, then I'm coming to you.
I was just going to say, and as we talk digital, we must not forget film. Because film is where we tell our stories. Right now, all the stories are coming from out, and those are the stories that our youth see, and therefore that's what they learn. So we must invest in digital infrastructure for film. Right now, many of our film theaters are being converted to churches, and I have no problem with churches. It's just that people are not watching all the movies that they need to, and that's where culture is also getting lost. So we need to be able to ensure we're investing in all the infrastructure, not just broadband.
So film, TV series, documentaries, the African stories. Omole, I'm coming to you now, and I know you have something to contribute. And as you prepare to share your views on the conversation, a very interesting question has been posted by Ratsima, and I think you're the perfect person to try to answer this one. What is a digital economy? Isn't it too far away from the population's needs for me to have access to water, sanitation, housing, basic infrastructure before digital economy is more important? How would you respond to that?
Well, thank you for asking that question. It's an important one because, I mean, if you can't eat, then everybody talking about technology and digital, it becomes irrelevant to you. But just like Larry is saying, whether you like it or not, the world is moving towards that. Everything that we're talking about, be it medical science, be it water, all of that, the bedrock now is technology. Transportation, technology. So technology is the bedrock of all those things. In fact, solving many of those challenges will come through technology. I like to give the example of maternal health. And we have a lot of people, not just maternal, just people dying because of something as simple as medical history. So somebody is sick, you get into a hospital, there's no medical history. Now imagine you had a card, like an ATM card, that you carry around with you. You're ill or anything, you enter any hospital, immediately it's put in, your medical history comes up. You're saved. So technology is the bedrock. So I empathize with the person asking that question, but the truth is we're going to solve those problems, those challenges through technology. So we can't ignore technology. Right. Otherwise we become extinct.
Thank you. And you know, just to further answer that question, if you think of the young Pokot man looking after cattle somewhere in Kenya, in a semi-arid area, who has incredible challenges, being able to understand weather patterns based on the technology that he uses on his phone, being able to understand where his cattle are using drone cameras. I mean, there's so much that technology could do. So, you know, very exciting time. I posted by somebody else, I can't even pronounce this name, Optimistic. Okay, optimistic. But spelt in a very interesting way. How do we influence leaders and convince them that digital transformation and e-governance can yield the desired results? We started this morning with Maktar telling us that leaders have taken this agenda on, especially from the ministers and the AUC. Can you here tell us with certainty that there is political will and commitment to drive this agenda through? I would like to respond.
Yes, I think there is political will. And earlier when Zaid was presenting, she did mention the role of the AU in really making sure they put in place a framework that sets standards and regulations, continent-wide standards and regulations that allow for us as governments to plug in and say, if we are going to be rolling out these digital solutions, how do we do it in a manner that makes them interoperable and inclusive? And then to the next level, and I think the starting point is with the African Commission, the African Union Commission that sort of creates those standards and policies at a policy level. Then you have the Smart Africa Alliance, which now is more at the implementation level, where we've had a collective resolve as governments to say, can we create an organization that allows us to share best practices of what we've implemented in terms of our specific digital transformation agendas, so that today if I'm implementing smart cities, Kenya or Ghana do not have to burn some circuits trying to implement something, but can learn from what we've done, and in a way we are able to move in a much faster, inclusive and equal way as an African continent.
Excellent.
So I think at a government level, at the AU level, we're all coordinated to make sure that digital inclusion, digital transformation agenda trickles down at all aspects of governance.
Thank you. Would anyone like to add, Amani, please?
Yes, so we do have now a resolution that was taken, in the last summit in February by heads of states to develop this digital transformation strategy for the continent. We had in November the summit, African-European Summit on digital economy. We're having the AU-EU task force on digitization. We're having with the Broadband Commission with all the UN agencies a clear guidance on digital transformation on the continent, and Smart Africa, of course, and in most of these commitments, the private sector is very much present, so that's an important element. The level of commitment cannot be overemphasized, and what I can say that all the stars are aligned now for Africa for this digital transformation. It's really up to us now to seize the opportunity.
The stars are aligned. Minister Nasser, would you like to add?
I just want to confirm there is commitment from the highest political level, for sure, definitely. It has been reiterated by heads of state, by the President of the African Union, and that has been officially announced again in Sharm el-Sheikh, and we're in action now. We're beyond the political commitment. There is the vision put by heads of state, but also governments are moving forward with the implementation, because we want to move from vision, strategies to reality. And we want to also, as Egypt is the chair for the African Union, we're very committed, and we are working again very closely with our development partners on that, and we are also scaling up. We are very happy with the initiative, the digital initiative of the World Bank Group. And we're also working closely with IFC colleagues to bring in the private sector, because the challenge is how to move fast in areas that we have lagged behind. So that will require not just the resources from the African government, but also scaling up with the private sector. For example, we've signed an agreement with Liquid and with Apple during the Sharm el-Sheikh event, because that scaling up will help us achieve at a fast track. And that is important. And that's where the role of the government, I totally agree with you that the role of the government is to ensure that the environment is conducive for the private sector to come in, because we cannot deliver on that alone. That's for a fact. And hence we need to work also in integrating, because also even the utilities issue, I think digital helps a lot. In healthcare service, in education, in utilities, because what Africa sometimes needs is the expertise and the knowledge, and investing in human capital and digital can help us move fast track on that.
Thank you. And I should just mention that, never before have I seen such a willingness and commitment for the different sectors to work together. And I think World Bank is doing a lot in this space. And IFC, I believe, are partners of C-Squared and Andela. So a lot is happening. Joe, you can...
And I want to highlight here that not only the World Bank Group, but actually their engagement at the highest level, also from senior management, has brought up other international institutions that were not engaged in Africa, such as the EBRD, European Bank for Construction. Their mandate initially did not include African countries. Now, through the bank and through Egypt, they were able to negotiate regional infrastructure projects, because that's also a requirement that the government should step in with. So we are able to scale up from other institutions that are interested in investing in Africa. The Asian Infrastructure Bank, European Investment Bank was also there, the president. So they all announced their commitment and their pledges to support the digital initiative that is coordinated by the World Bank Group.
Thank you very much, Minister Nasser. Yes, Joe.
Yeah, Julie, I was just going to say, I came from private sector. Yes. And if you want to know about commitment, you just follow the money. Follow the money and look at where we are today. We are talking at the World Bank Group headquarters, and you're talking about Africa digital economy moonshot. That tells you the money is moving in the direction where policy and commitment is. And if you look at many of the discussions that we've had with our heads of state, many times the ICT ministers were not involved. Now we are at the seat in most of these meetings. In fact, last month, we were all out meeting together to just discuss what is the strategy. From the Smart Africa board meeting, we were directed that we must all meet and actually drive the agenda. It shouldn't be driven by other ministers.
Right.
These are the commitments that are making a difference. Some of my newest friends are from even the World Bank. They are here, which means that the transformation is there at the top. And I can tell you it's also pressure from the youth and the citizens. The citizens are now all digital.
Thank you.
In Kenya, with what we call the Big Four agenda of our president, where you're talking of affordable health care, universal, you're talking about affordable housing, you're talking about universal health care, you're talking about manufacturing. All these have to do with jobs, but technology is at the heart. We're registering all the farmers so that we know what inputs they need so that they can be able to then produce properly. So the commitment is 100%.
Thank you. I'm coming to each of you for a parting shot, and I want to connect it to a question that was asked, which in a way I think we have answered, but I want us to keep this in mind as we leave this session. This is Musica Timothy. He says, as is the case for most programs in developing countries, the immediate beneficiaries are the residents of urban centers. How can we make sure this new vision reaches rural residents as well? I do believe we've touched on that. Omowale, I'll start with you and your parting shot on this. That if Africa is to transform truly, we must make it intentional that all of us are able to move in this new digital economy, that we are all able to find a space and to thrive. In order to do so, what's your parting shot to everybody in this room?
I think two things. They say half of winning is showing up. If Africa is going to win this digital economy, we need to show up. And what's showing up? Digital, somebody talked about digital ID, a situation where we have less than 50% on the internet is not showing up. And that's where we also need help from the government and from organizations like, the World Bank and IFC. So we need to do that. The other thing is awareness. We asked about what the government can do. I think we take it for granted that people know the importance of technology, but I don't think that's the case, because I attended a program in Nigeria where we had a lot of government officials, and when we spoke, the results of our speaking, people were galvanized, and the government was like, okay, what can we do, what can we do? We have 54 distinct countries in Africa. I'm happy for programs like this. We have ministers here now. So we need to do more of this awareness so that people know how important this digital revolution is.
Thank you very much. Joe?
Mine is to say that plans that are put together are able, and I've seen them come to life. I mean, like C-squared, when it began and the ideas, when it was being cooked, you would think, well, this is ambitious, this is big, but the kind of transformation that is happening is real. So these plans that we're seeing being put down can actually be implemented, they can work. I've been waiting to see Project Loon take off. At least in Kenya. It's something that we've been pushing. That means that you'll have 4G coverage 100% in the whole country. That means everyone will be receiving broadband wherever they are. Wow. They don't need to move to the urban centers. They can work from there. They can receive their digital payments. They can even receive their education, whatever it is, in those places. Right. The key thing is that some of these ideas that are presented sometimes seem that like they are pie in the sky, but for me, I've actually seen them come to life, and they are real and they will transform. And so everyone that is involved in the policies, in the strategies, and in the planning, be committed. We will actually see this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sahar, please.
There is commitment at the highest political level for digital transformation. There is need definitely for more integration among African countries, and there is commitment, and hence we need to work very closely, ensure that the investment is conducive for private sector to come in. That's very critical, but also that we are able to work very closely with our development partners to make it happen on fast track.
Thank you so much for that. Amani.
Not to repeat what was said earlier, yes, the African Union, thanks to our leaders, is leading on the digital transformation strategy for the continent with the help of all partners, bridging the gap not just in infrastructure, physical infrastructure for connectivity, but also physical infrastructure itself in energy, remember, we would not, ICT would not work without energy. And decentralized stations in rural areas using the new technology and using the ICT technology for payment and is turning also the lives of our people in rural areas, including.
From the World Bank Group, I am Saeed Halimi. We're continuing our 24 hours epic live stream event with experts from the bank and around the globe. It's now 4 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. In Marrakesh, it's 9 in the morning, 10 a.m. in Paris, and it's 4 in the afternoon in Kuala Lumpur. We have much more to come, but for now, let's take a look at the recent discussion at our spring meetings. Stephanie Flanders of Bloomberg hosted the session of leveraging trade to reduce poverty.
What is so concerning to you at the moment about the trade uncertainty in the world and the potential risks that this might pose for poverty reduction and the developing economies?
Well, thank you for bringing that question of what does it mean for reduction of poverty. And it is bad news. We have a long history to prove that trade is good for growth, it is good for jobs, and it is good for poverty reduction. When we look at the projected future, by 2030, we are expected to go down to 3% extreme poverty. This is the global goal. All other things equal, today, at best, we will be at 6%. And if you live in sub-Saharan Africa, probably somewhere between 25 and 30%. And that at best is no more valid because a slowdown in trade, increased uncertainty, also means that it would serve as an additional factor that makes that achieving that goal of poverty eradication more difficult. So we have some research, most recent, that tells us that already we see an increase in poverty numbers by some 12, 13 million people. But there is a second reason we are very worried, because we know trade is also very good for peace. And conflicts are one of the biggest drivers of extreme poverty. If you look at history between 1970 and 2010, when trade was ratcheting up, 7-fold increase in trade also coincides with 94% decrease in fatalities due to conflict. So trade makes the opportunity cost of war much higher. We have new research that shows that in the Great Lakes region, conflicts where people trade are 2.4 times fewer and less damaging. So we worry about that, breaking this link between trade and peace. And last but absolutely not least, we worry that we are mixing up apples and oranges. Yes, jobs are being lost, but mostly because of technological transformation and much less because of trade. And yet, we are allowing to pin on the back of trade the accusation for massive job loss. And you're right, we have a duty to relentlessly make the case for trade. And I'm going to finish with my favorite point on that, which is Vietnam. Anybody from Vietnam in the audience? Okay, fabulous case, because 80s, 90s, Vietnam cleaned up its plate in terms of barriers to trade. And what happened was poverty in Vietnam dropped from 60% to 3%. And I dream for that to happen in sub-Saharan Africa as well.
Christine, you've talked in the World Economic Outlook and elsewhere, I think last week, about the precarious state of the global economy, and obviously trade tensions play a part in that. But this week is about thinking about the world and not just the loud debates that come out of US and Europe. What does it mean for developing countries, that precariousness and the impact of trade uncertainties?
I want to also concentrate on what it means for them to have a lot of trade. And I would like to echo what Kristalina was saying regarding development, which is propelled by trade, peace, which is facilitated by trade. And I think that developing countries are much more at risk than many other countries in those two respects. So trade is critically important. I'd like to make 2 points. One is trade has been, is, and will be an accelerator of innovation, of productivity, and of growth. We've done joint studies between the bank, the WTO, and the IMF to demonstrate that to the face of the earth. So anybody who doesn't want growth should indeed not have trade. But I'm yet to meet a policymaker who says, no, I don't want any growth. That's not true. That's point number one. Point number two, it reduces the cost of living and has done so over the course of time in a differentiated way, if you will, because if you look at advanced economies and you look at high-income households, their cost of living has been reduced by 25% because of trade. If you look at low-income households, it is by 2/3 that their cost of living has been reduced as a result of trade. Now, it is not to say that trade is all good and perfect, and Kristalina alluded to that. The benefit of this current tension is that it really puts the finger on those that have been left out and left to the side, either because of trade or because of technology or because of both. And sometimes it's difficult to disentangle the two. And I think that's an entirely different chapter that needs big attention and budget spending and engagement from the public and the private sector to make sure that trade benefits all, which it doesn't necessarily at the moment. And that has been not sufficiently focused on. The second point I would like to make is that we don't need less trade, we need more trade. Because at the moment we have a lot of trade on goods, tangible products, but not much on services. And on services we have still a lot of non-tariff barriers, and tariff barriers for that matter, but Roberto knows much more than I do about that. But what I know for sure is that when you look at most economies in the world, they rely heavily on the service sector. You're talking about anywhere between 70 and more than 80% of those economies that is generated by a service activity. Well, service needs to be traded in a freer and fairer way. And all of you have telephones. Some of you are using it to register what's going on. You'll be able to send that to relatives or to friends or to do a little video out of it. Well, thanks to those technologies, a lot of those services are movable, tradable in a completely unimpaired way. That activity has to be freer, has to be easier to trade than it is at the moment. And I think it's a blessing that 76 countries back in, was it in January, have decided to join forces, not on a completely multilateral basis, but on a plurilateral basis, to move forward in terms of opening up of the trade in e-commerce, finally. So yes, we need more trade. We need to look at trade with a different pair of spectacles in order to ensure that everybody is included.
And the focus on services, I think, is very interesting. I think the Bank of England has estimated that if you had the same liberalisation for services that we've had for goods, you could also half the excess current account imbalances that have also caused the tensions. I mean, Roberto, on this point, and more generally, I know that the digital e-commerce and services are a big part of your agenda for the WTO. And where does reducing poverty sit in that reform agenda, or as a driver for it?
It sits squarely in that conversation. But let me start by saying just very briefly that it's the second time in the span of a week that I'm the only man on the panel. So that is really great. And I hope that happens more and more often. But anyway, I think the key element to bear in mind when you're talking about new technologies, when you're talking about particularly electronic commerce, is the fact that it is an enabler for the small players. It reduces costs. It reduces particularly the costs of distance, of logistics. And for the small player, the small and medium enterprises, the SMEs, the cost of the transaction is fundamental. For the big company, uncertainties, the cost of the transaction is a line on the spreadsheet. For the small company, it means the transaction will happen or will not happen. It's as simple as that. And electronic commerce has the ability to lower the costs very, very significantly. We had a study recently that showed that if we in fact provide the right regulations, the infrastructure, the means in developing countries to benefit from the digital technologies to do trade, the percentage share of developing countries in global trade would jump from 43 to 57% in just 15 years. But that's a huge amount of potential that we see in this technology. The small companies also have a big advantage to them as far as society is concerned. Number one, they're the biggest providers of jobs. In most economies, they provide more than half the jobs in the economy. In some least developed countries, they provide more than 90%. Another fantastic characteristic of the digital trade is the fact that it induces more gender balance as well. One of the things that we have in our statistics is that the participation of women on companies that do online trade doubles compared to the women that participate in companies that are working solely offline. So all of these things clearly show that there is huge potential when you're talking about the digital economy, e-commerce, and that's something that we're trying to handle right now at the WTO. Christine just mentioned that initiative. We were in 2019, we are in 2019, and until this year, members were not truly talking about e-commerce in the WTO. So it is really something that we have to grasp. And just to conclude, and it's really sometimes incredible that I hear people saying that discussions about e-commerce, particularly in the WTO, is going to simply crystallize and favor the big companies, the mega multinationals or the big, huge platforms. And that's absolutely the opposite. If we do nothing, if there is no conversation whatsoever in terms of harmonization, facilitating the platforms and the participation of the small and medium enterprises in the digital economy, it is then that the global digital economy will be a preserve of the big companies, because they will survive. What we have today is a completely unregulated and undisciplined environment, which, by the way, for the small and medium enterprise is a deal breaker. lack of information, lack of predictability, lack of rules. They don't make the rules, they don't play by the rules, they adapt to the rules that are made by the big ones. So this is something that I think we have to dispel, this kind of a misguided vision about what talking about e-commerce actually means in a global environment.
And that's actually something that economic research can help with. I see actually Michael Spence, the Nobel Prize winner, has written research which points out that if we maybe think there are mixed effects of e-commerce and the rise of the big internet giants in developed countries, actually the gains to the poor are much clearer and have maybe come more quickly in developing countries. I mean, Kristalina, is that a message that you've not managed to get across?
This is a message that we have to figure out how to get across. Just take one example, the Philippines. In 10 years, the Philippines have increased trade in services because of the internet 10 times. 10 years ago, they had 100,000 people in sort of outsourced services. Today, they have 1 million, 10 times more jobs. 10 years ago, they would export 1.4 billion as a result of that. Today, they export 18 billion. And that is just one of many, 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 many examples. And what is actually most rewarding to see is how that unleashes the potential for women. And I'm so glad you brought that point in. Among other things, when companies are not facing the owner or the workers, but especially the owner, women-led businesses flourish. When they go in the room and they meet whoever they're trading with, and it is a man, they may not get the business. They're online, you cannot see, is it a man, is it a woman? Boom, business goes up. So there are tremendous opportunities of unleashing trade in services, but especially of making sure that the internet is available everywhere for everyone. And on this one, I just want to make a point that is a very, very important point, that if we talk about trade, especially trade in services, but also in goods, and we do not think of a deepening digital divide, we are stopping in the middle of the road. Africa today has only 24% of people connected to the internet. The average for the world is 50%. You go in more advanced economies, it is 80+%. So to me, part of the issue around revitalizing trade, and if you wish, jazzing up trade, is to connect trade, especially in services, and access to the internet. We as institutions have made a commitment to Africa. We call it Africa Moonshot. And it is by 2030 to have every African citizen, business, and government service connected to the internet. And why this is so exciting? Because if that is Moonshot for Africa, that means the World Bank is NASA.
I was struck, the research that the bank has done that in sort of as a background to this event, was quite honest about the impact of trade liberalization in some countries where there wasn't enough effort to get out to the rural area. Actually, people in the rural area sometimes suffered, even though the other populations benefited. I mean, there is a lot of nuance in those studies that we have to grapple with.
Well, that is a space for honesty, indeed. Unless we understand what is the impact of policies, especially on the poor and most vulnerable, and then we think through measures that can be put in place to protect against this impact, then we would have a backlash, but even worse, we would have negative consequences for people. What we do at the bank is to be much more conscious of what policies we can recommend that provide social safety nets to people, but more interestingly, what policies we can provide, we can promote that offer social safety ropes that help people to help themselves. And we find that it is, of course, about access to finance, access to managerial accounting support for new entrepreneurs, access to fast internet, and that to us, I can say very humbly, we realize that what we used to do in a fast-moving world is just simply not enough. We have two major initiatives at the bank. One we call human capital, investing in people, making sure that countries have more agile, easily deployable labor force. And the second one is around this understanding of policies that promote entrepreneurship and self-reliance rather than policies, traditional safety nets that sort of put money in the hands of people but don't really create that opportunity to rely on yourself. I just want to make one additional point on that issue of differentiating between technology and trade. And the point comes actually from a study we did for the European Union. We looked at the last decade and we found out that the EU lost 15% old jobs, low-skilled jobs. And the EU gained, guess what, 15% new jobs. So you look at this and say, what's your problem? 15 gone, 15 came, it equals, right? But it doesn't, because the people who lost their jobs do not have the skills to migrate into the new jobs. And that all, in fact, has not only social consequences, but political consequences. If you look at the political landscape in Europe and the rise of populism, part of it is grounded in that reality. And again, we have to admit it, understand it, have measures against it, but not fall in the trap to call all of it a consequence of trade. In fact, when we studied it, it is a small proportion that is driven by changing trade patterns. It is a big proportion that is driven by technological change.
But Stephanie, can I just make one point in response to your question about developing countries? Because we have to look and dig into the trade numbers and how the trade flows are engineered. And we had a really interesting study done on sub-Saharan African countries to see what the impact of the Pan-African trade recently negotiated and now finally in place regional agreement. And it's fascinating to see that most of the trade between sub-Saharan African countries and the rest of the world is dominated by commodities, 84% roughly. But then you look at the trade between sub-Saharan African countries, and obviously you have the issues of infrastructure, of the last mile, and all the rest of it. But most of the trade between African countries, which will be the food for this Pan-African free trade agreement, that is not commodities. It is manufacturing products. It is value-added products. So I think the different layers of trade vary, and I don't think we can say, as a result of trade tensions, there will be an impact. It's going to be differentiated depending on the nature of trade that countries have amongst themselves and with the rest of the world.
And Roberto, we have the kind of honesty and sort of honest conversations around the things that need to be better in trade liberalization, but also in policies generally. I mean, how much do you think, how much is that part of the conversation that you want to have in the WTO when you're thinking about trade? Because it certainly, it's accepting the small part that's a problem, which gives you more credibility in making the larger claims, and that is obviously true for the WTO as well, in thinking about people's attitudes to trade.
Yeah, I think it's important to maybe start answering the question, just hammering down one point. When we talk about trade, and Kristalina was saying just now, the problem is that, you know, the fact that you're creating jobs is more than you're losing, or roughly equaling that, that's no consolation for the person who lost his job. So that has a political impact, and trade is not going to resolve that. It is not. So what we're trying to do is not only to make sure that we have predictability, because predictability is absolutely critical for trade, it is also that we have inclusiveness. So a lot of what we're doing now is about facilitating trade and trying to make sure that trade benefits reach everyone. So there are conversations now on small and medium enterprises. There's a group of almost 80 countries that is talking about how to make things better for a small and medium enterprise. E-commerce is another one. There's another group that is doing facilitation of investments, how to make investments flow better for developing countries. Another one that is about empowerment of women that we're doing. So this is how I think the WTO can help, is to ensure that the rules, the disciplines that we put in place actually translate into getting more people benefiting from trade.
I wanted to raise something else, another sort of challenge to this, which comes from a different direction, and you've all mentioned it already, which is technology. But if you look at a country like Vietnam, and you look, that is a classic model of development that we have, that is very much a trade-led model of development. You move along and you move up the value chain, and it's a very familiar story. But a question is now being raised about whether other countries will be able to walk that path, whether they'll be allowed to by the global system, but also whether it'll even be available, because the same producers who might have been wanting to get cheaper workers in Vietnam, who are currently using more expensive workers in China because wages are going up, are now saying, well, I could go to Vietnam, or I could just put robots in the factory. So how does that change this sort of our vision of trade as an enabler?
The traditional way, of course, is being challenged, it's being changed. You go to Bangladesh, where textile is the big driver of growth and jobs. Now they're importing robots from Germany, and instead of having mostly women working in the factories, they have robots. We have to all adjust to this reality, but I just want to say one thing that sometimes we forget about. I think Christine touched upon it a bit, that when we talk about drivers of growth and trade, we always think of these big multinational flows, and yet if I think of Africa, for example, there is so much that can happen, just Africans trading with each other and being able to move across borders. If we go back in history, as human race, from the very moment we became economically active, we actually trade. I produce what I'm good at, and I trade it for what you produce, what you're good at. And that, I cannot imagine that we become so dumb to forget that very simple principle, that division of labor and specialization make us all better off. And in that area, there is one thing that we don't talk enough about, and it is not tariffs, but it is trade facilitation. In other words, reducing the barriers for countries to trade. I have, from my colleagues, my favorite example is Honduras and Guatemala. So they used to, just because of barriers of crossing the borders and custom duties and custom checks, they used to take an average of 10 hours for a truck with goods to cross the border, 10 hours. So the drivers would have hammocks, and they would be waiting there for the 10 hours. Now, trade facilitation means that it dropped from 10 hours to 15 minutes. So there is a negative trade impact for the producers of hammocks, but beyond that, beyond that, and that we look at, in fact, our studies say that if Africa was to reduce by half the trade facilitation barriers, the GDP of Africa would be boosted by 12%. If Africa eliminates tariffs entirely, GDP would go up by 5%. So my point here is that we have to be persistent of always pursuing the best economic interests of countries and actually go out and tell the stories of why we would be completely lost if we give on specialization and trade.
And that's it for this segment of Econothon, the World Bank Group's 24 hours non-stop talk fest. But don't go away, we have a lot more coming up. And welcome to my colleagues in Accra who will be taking over the reins for the next 2 hours.